Well, Sword Art Online isn't bad, it's just moderately above average. So why did a merely okay anime that gets so much hate become a global phenomenon and redefine the anime landscape? To find the answer, we have to look past the vitriol and look at the one thing SAO did that no other anime ever tried before. SAO was okay. It's the type of show you watch to see how the plot pans out and how the mystery and conflict is resolved, rather than because you enjoyed every individual moment. Once you start watching it, you just can't stop, because you have to see how the situation pans out, how the plot gets resolved, and how the mysteries set up in the show are revealed. And you just can't let it go until you learn the answers and resolution. The show is a plot-driven narrative loop, where the overarching mystery and the desire for resolution are so strong that they completely override a viewer's complaints about the moment-to-moment writing issues. And for the first two seasons, the main complaints are about the characters and the execution, and not about the fundamental plot. Criticism often focuses on the individual moments, like the flat dialogue, sudden time skips, or characters acting illogically, but the foundational hooks of the show are incredibly powerful. The series has an ultimate high-stakes hook. The core premise, if you die in the game, you die in real life, is an instantly gripping conflict. It creates a baseline of tension that forces you to keep watching because you desperately want to see how they escape the prison and what are the results of this extreme situation. How do the characters deal with it, and how does everything set up by this scenario eventually pan out? You aren't just watching to see whether Kirito wins his next fight. You're watching because you want to know what happens to everyone trapped inside the game. You want to know who survives, who dies, who's responsible, and whether the characters will ever actually escape. This is most notable in the third story arc, the Phantom Bullet arc, the Gun Gale Online mystery with Sinan, which many praise because it refocuses on a dark, psychological whodunit mystery rather than just romance or fantasy tropes. And it refocuses the anime story on complex plots that leave the viewer wanting answers. The Death Gun mystery gives the audience another reason to keep watching. There is a question that needs to be answered, and the viewer is constantly encouraged to think about what is really happening. The story creates a mystery, introduces a threat, and then slowly gives the audience pieces of information that make them want to discover the full picture. But as gripping and engaging as the plot, mysteries, and conflicts are, they only have an effect once a viewer is in through the door, and the series has already hooked them. To get the viewers in through the door and hooked in the first place, we have to look at the series' core foundational premise. SAO was originally written in 2002, and the anime premiered in 2012. At this time, video games, including MMORPGs, had just exploded in popularity, and the concept of what if real life functioned as a game was just too tantalizing to ignore for a huge, massive potential anime audience that were also gamers. This was the perfect time for a series like SAO to appear. Video games were no longer a niche hobby that only a small part of the population understood. MMORPGs had become a major part of gaming culture, and millions of people were familiar with the idea of creating a character, leveling up, gaming equipment, and exploring a massive virtual world. SAO took all these familiar ideas and asked a terrifying question. What if this wasn't actually a game? Before SAO was first written in 2002, Isekai was not a new concept in Japanese popular culture. There were plenty of Isekai anime before SAO, but most of them didn't have video game mechanics. There were some Isekai with video game mechanics, but they were seen as glorified toy commercials, and were written in the pre-MMO era. The one exception to this was .hack/sign. However, though .hack/sign was the one darker, more serious story in this category, and .hack/sign did use video game mechanics, it was a game to almost all the players in the universe. SAO was real, or functionally the same as real, in universe. There were series that had video game mechanics, and there were series where the world was completely real to everyone in it, and that were serious, high-stakes, mature, dark series. But SAO was the first to combine the two into one story at the same time. What if the game suddenly becomes real was a completely novel concept at the time, and this is what made the series so immediately accessible. You didn't need to be an expert in MMORPGs to understand the premise. The basic idea could be explained in one sentence. Thousands of people are trapped inside a video game, and if they die in the game, they die in real life. That is an incredibly simple premise, but it opens up an almost unlimited number of questions. How would society function inside a video game? What would happen if people could no longer log out? Would people continue treating it like a game, or would they eventually accept it as their new reality? What happens when the rules of a game become the laws of life and death? So, SAO's concepts were revolutionary and completely novel at the time it came out. And so the series delivered a completely fresh, highly addictive concept at the exact perfect historical moment. However, the series is widely criticized and hated on. So why is that the case? And let's see why these aspects haven't stopped large audiences from loving the series. Some aspects of the show, like Kirito's relationship with his sister cousin, are not especially well liked, but people are very willing to overlook aspects and things they perceive as a turnoff if it only appears on screen for a small portion of the time, doesn't completely dominate the plot, and can just be completely ignored for the vast majority of the time. Not every element of a story has to be universally loved for the story itself to be successful. A viewer can dislike one character, one relationship, or one subplot, and still enjoy everything else that the series has to offer. Another thing is the main villain of the final story arc, who sets the whole scenario and story into motion, largely forgets his motivation, and it's never properly explained in the anime. But that's at the end of the anime. By the time the first story is at its conclusion, fans are already satisfied with the course of the series up to that point, and they don't have time to dwell on it much because the story arc is about to end. And by the time the next story arc, fans have already forgotten about that and are focusing on the events of the next story. This is one of the strange advantages of a highly plot-driven series. Once the mystery is resolved, the audience immediately has another mystery to focus on. The story keeps moving forward, and the viewer's attention moves with it. Another thing about the series some criticize is that the societal and psychological consequences are hand-waved. After the mass deaths, Kirito and his friends go right back to normal life as if nothing happened. But the fans are watching the story for the video game action, world building, and to see how the story resolves itself and the main conflicts. They aren't focusing on what the characters are doing in the real world, except for what relates directly to how that resolves the plot. The anime does occasionally show the consequences of what happened, but it doesn't spend most of its time exploring the long-term psychological trauma of surviving a situation where thousands of people died. The show gives its audience a constant stream of questions and answers, and that can be more powerful than the individual weaknesses of the writing. So far, I've only addressed criticisms I think actually is somewhat legit. People hate on this show for a number of reasons, but I'm not including reasons I don't think are fair or legitimate. For example, if a person criticizes SAO for having an OP protagonist, that really means they just don't like stories with OP protagonist. If you don't like overpowered protagonist, that means stories with OP protagonist just aren't for you in particular, not that all series with OP protagonists are bad. The same applies to many other criticisms. Some people simply don't like the way SAO tells its story, some don't like its romance, some don't like its characters, but there is a difference between saying, I don't like this type of story, and saying, this type of story cannot be good. A story can be flawed and still be successful. A character can be overpowered and still be entertaining. So the most severe, meaningful criticism one could come up with for Sword Art Online is that the story compromised its own stakes, deflated its main villain, and refused to let its characters truly suffer the realistic consequences of their reality. But I already addressed why fans wouldn't care about that and would still watch the anime anyway earlier. Because at the end of the day, Sword Art Online succeeded because it understood something extremely important about entertainment. You don't necessarily need to create the best written story ever made. You need to create a story that people desperately want to keep watching. SAO's biggest strength is not that every scene is amazing. It isn't its biggest strength, is that the story constantly creates questions that the audience wants answered. What happens when the game becomes reality? How do you escape? Who created this world? Why did they do it? Who is going to survive? What happens after they escape? What is the next level? What is the next mystery? And what is waiting around the corner? Sword Art Online created an incredibly powerful narrative hook at exactly the right moment in anime and gaming history. It combined the rapidly growing popularity of MMORPGs with the timeless appeal of being transported to another world, and then added the ultimate consequence, death. That combination made the series feel fresh, even if the execution wasn't always perfect. And that is ultimately why Sword Art Online became a global phenomenon. It wasn't necessarily because it was the greatest anime ever made, it was because it was the right anime at the right time with the right premise.